Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on digital technologies and atrocity prevention. Welcome to everybody who's joining us from around the world. My name is Savita Pandey, and I'm the Executive Director of the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. On behalf of the delegation of the European Union to the United Nations and the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, I would welcome you all and thank you for joining us today. In a world where access to information and capacity to connect with other people around the world is evolving at an exponential pace, new and emerging technologies are impacting nearly every facet of our life. Within the field of atrocity prevention, we have witnessed how new technologies have raised the risk of atrocities by providing platforms to rapidly amplify messaging of hate, by giving governments new means of restricting rights through mass surveillance, or restrictions on access to the internet and information, and by giving potential perpetrators tools to commit atrocity crimes. We have also seen how technology has rapidly shifted the pace and increased our capacity for sharing information, monitoring, and documenting the spread of violence, hateful rhetoric, and other risk factors of atrocity crimes, and compelling decision makers to act. The digital technologies have been weaponized to sow divisions and hate by some, but have also brought us all closer together. I mean, this virtual event is an example of that, we are joining and seeing each other, even though we are sitting in different parts of the world. It has helped us cultivate public discourse, which is inclusive and diverse, and enabling rapid, time-sensitive information to be shared very, very quickly. In today's event, our expert panel will discuss both sides of the role of technology in the atrocity prevention space, highlighting how technology can create new risks, but can also help us mitigate those risks, help us share information, document atrocities in such a way that we can then create better capacities for accountability. With that in mind, I would first like to go to our co-host and give the floor to Ambassador Silvio Gusanto to provide us with some opening remarks, and then it will be my pleasure to introduce our expert panel. So, Ambassador Gusanto, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Savita, and it's really a great pleasure to be hosting this event together with the Global Center for R2P. It's a great collaboration that we have. This briefing for us is part of the efforts we are making to raise understanding about the principle of R2P and also how it can be operationalized in different contexts. And today we're looking at the digital one, which is very often now on the agenda of the UN. So digital now is very trendy here in New York. It's also, when we look at the principle of R2P, we also have to look at the underlying causes that provide fertile ground for atrocities and for atrocity mindset to grow. And the digital sphere is definitely an area where we have to look more closely at the origins of this type of trends. As you pointed out, digital technologies provide unique opportunities, and we should continue to look at the positive side, because I think too often sometimes we emphasize the risks, but we should also talk about the opportunities. And clearly also in this area, digital technologies can be used to raise awareness, to promote and preserve human rights, also to detect early warning signs and help us prevent atrocities. And provide a safe and enabling space also for civil society, for human rights defenders across the world. However, as you pointed out, there are also dangers, and we see that digital technology can be a tremendous accelerator in disseminating hatred and intolerance. We've seen this in the recent presentation by the Secretary General of the UN's intention to come up with a code of conduct on the integrity of public information. I think the UN system is really quite concerned by the spreading of hate speech across social media platforms, and they want to do something about it. And they also have emphasized, as we have in the EU, the responsibility of online intermediaries regarding illegal content published on their platforms, which is not protected by the freedom of expression. The EU has been pioneering in this respect. When I was still in Brussels, we adopted a voluntary code of conduct with the major platforms. And this code of conduct basically commits the online platforms to swiftly review and, if necessary, remove alleged illegal hate speech, which is notified to them. And since then, the code of conduct has been reviewed and extended to other actors. And then in November last year, we had the adoption of the Digital Services Act, which turns some of these provisions into enforceable rules. They are now part of the EU law and provide a comprehensive approach for tackling all forms of illegal content online. The DSA, as we call it, the Digital Services Act, introduces transparency obligation for online platforms as regards their content moderation activities, terms and conditions, algorithm, recommender systems used, and online advertisings. And it focuses, of course, on the very large online platforms, which are now obliged to assess and mitigate systemic risks. So they have to take responsibility for what is published on their platforms. So these are some of the tools and policies that we have put in place in order to address the risks. But it will be interesting to hear today also what are the opportunities we have through digital technologies to prevent atrocities. So I wish everybody a very good and fruitful discussion. Thank you, Savita.
Thank you, Ambassador Zanato. And I think that it's just such a important thing that you've placed in front of us, that, you know, codes of conduct, legislation around these issues is so important. I mean, we have helped to do media accountable. So it's time also now for states to think very, very strategically about how they are holding social media accountable, because it is a place for amplifying messages, both good and bad. So thank you for that intervention, and thank you for laying out all the good progress that we are making and how EU can be an example for other jurisdictions to follow suit. With those sort of encouraging words, let's begin and introduce our expert and very distinguished panel. It is my great privilege to have you here with us and to welcome you. I would like to first welcome Under Secretary General Alice Nderitu. She is the UN Under Secretary General and Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide. We have Peter Micek with us, who is the General Counsel at Access Now and lecturer at the Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. We have Federica Alexandra, who's the Deputy Director of the University of Oxford's Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict, and Christopher Tuckwood, who is Executive Director of the Sentinel project. It is a pleasure to have you all with us today. And as you have already been notified, that this is going to be a question and answer session, so that we can have a little bit more of an interaction. And please also, in your remarks, feel free to respond to what others are saying while you are sort of putting your thoughts forward. And I will start with a question to each of you, and then sort of, you know, go the other way around so that everybody has a chance to speak. And if we have any time left, we can also take some questions from the audience. This event is going to be recorded and will be available on our website. You can also interact with the Global Center on Twitter if you feel like it. And with that, I will go to the first question, and the first question is to USG Nderitu. Alice, the UN Secretary General recently submitted a report requested by the Human Rights Council discussing the progress made on the prevention of genocide, with the specific focus on the impact of technological advances on genocide prevention efforts and on the risk of the perpetration of genocide. With that in mind, in what ways have you witnessed new technologies raising the risk of genocide and mass atrocities, or used by perpetrators to commit crimes? Thank you.
Thank you, Savita. And first, I must thank the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect and the European Union for organizing this excellent panel discussion, because these are very important and timely topic, as both of you have said. And digital technologies and atrocity prevention remains extremely important. And we've seen the impact of all these new technologies in almost all aspects of our daily lives. And I'm speaking about those of us who are in spaces where there is electricity and connection to digital technology. So we've seen the impact from the way we communicate, from the way we receive information, from how we acquire knowledge, even how we travel, how we work, everything. We've seen the impact. So that positive aspect of new technologies is extremely important and must be celebrated. However, this office still pays huge attention to offline risk factors for atrocity crimes. We do know that quite a number of risk factors exist offline and only amplified online. And we saw, like, throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, the positives, the technologies kept some of us connected, and the UN and many other partners were able to continue much, but not all of the critical work, thanks to digital technology. So we also know that new technologies have contributed to improving human life under very many aspects, including medicine and engineering. But in terms of the mandate, we do know that they've brought quite a number of negative implications, some of which we are only starting to see or learn the impact of. And I'm speaking about, for example, the right to privacy, online targeting and harassment, and an area that is especially important to my mandate as the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide has been the exponential growth we've witnessed in online hate speech, for which my office is the United Nations Global Focal Point, and incitement to discrimination, hostility, and violence. And we've seen this kind of hatred targeting groups based on their identity. And we do know that the Genocide Convention, the 1948 Genocide Convention, protects certain groups. We've seen those groups targeted. And we do know that this kind of hatred has often been demonstrated in the past to be a precursor and a trigger of hate crimes, violence, and even genocide. So it's a topic that it's really high on my agenda and caught my mandate. And I would say we speak about it virtually every day in this office. And we've seen the targeting of vulnerable populations by new technologies, including minority communities. We've seen the targeting of media practitioners and human rights defenders. And in many instances, in many contexts, I would say, these groups I've just mentioned are subject to online surveillance, harassment, and threats that aim to silence their voices. So we've seen the rapid expansion of social media platforms across the world, and we've had for quite a number of years now consistent roundtable conversations with tech and social media companies, Chatham House rules, where we discuss their business profit model and the mandate and how it impacts on the mandate. So we must say that without the corresponding content moderation resources and capacities, the expansion of this digital space has resulted in the exponential spread of online hate speech at a rate never seen before, which has contributed to division, violence, and in the most serious cases of atrocity crimes. And finally, we do see social media being used to disseminate these hateful narratives against these populations, including, and I'm emphasizing, racial, religious, ethnic, national groups, the protected groups in the Genocide Convention, as well as refugees and migrants, women, and people who are disabled or with diverse sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual characteristics. So often such narratives are instrumentalized for political gain, and that makes the targeted even more vulnerable. Thank you, Savita.
No, thank you, Alice, and thank you so much for laying out the field in a very particular way, and also to sort of just, tell us about the risks that different populations face and how their experience of atrocity crimes is different based on how they identify themselves. So now over to you, Peter. So from Myanmar to Ethiopia, perpetrators of potential atrocity crimes have reportedly used surveillance technology and internet shutdowns to help facilitate the commission of atrocities and shield themselves from accountability. How have such tools been used to disguise human rights violations and restrict space for human rights defenders, which Alice just talked about, and the media? And what can the international community do to respond to this?
Thank you so much, Savita, and thank you for allowing us to join today. Access Now has been operating for more than a decade, and a lot of that time has been dedicated to tracking the rise of disruptions of connectivity and internet access, especially through internet shutdowns. And we today run a Keep It On coalition, which includes more than 300 organizations globally tracking these events. And we're unfortunately seeing, after a slight dip during COVID, both the raw number of disruptions increase, but also their correlation with violence offline. And indeed, as the special representative just told us, the kind of secondary effects of internet interference grow deeper as the internet penetrates more societal systems. We're more dependent on the internet, and therefore, these events come with a higher cost. So whether in conflict zones or during mass protests, authorities are using internet shutdowns to hide serious human rights violations and sever communications. These impact human rights monitoring including of atrocities, also tracking and provision of humanitarian aid, and of course, efforts at accountability for these disruptions and the crimes that occurred during shutdowns. The scale and toll of internet shutdowns, which are intentional disruptions of connectivity, rose in 2022 as authorities hit the kill switch more often during chaos and violence. So 48 shutdowns occurred in 2022 across 14 countries in order to shroud violence and serious human rights abuses like murder, torture, rape, or apparent war crimes. Again, as I said, this correlation with violence, between violence and shutdowns, is increasing. In 2022. Again, 133 of the total 187 shutdowns occurred alongside some form of violence. We are glad to say that this is getting recognition, this trend of internet shutdowns, as we have a new report by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which does shed some light relevant to this discussion. That report says some shutdowns may even be implemented with a deliberate intent of covering up human rights violations, and both in the context of armed conflict and other circumstances, the inability to access tools to document and rapidly report abuses seems to contribute to further violence, including atrocities, end quote. That's from the OHCHR. And so to speak to your question, we are tracking shutdowns across conflict zones. Myanmar stands out. 330 townships in Myanmar experienced a shutdown in 2022. And the junta is strategically using shutdowns before and during attacks in areas where resistance is strongest. So shutdowns form part of a larger siege of the military's scorched earth strategy of killings, torture, and arrests. More recently, military airstrikes have attacked towns after their internet is shut off. In Ethiopia, the years-long internet shutdown in Tigray left folks in the dark and compounded the threats to Tigrayans' fundamental rights and safety. And so we saw there the shutdown providing cover for warring parties to commit heinous crimes, including systematic and widespread murder, rape, and sexual violence against vulnerable groups. It also prevented delivery of humanitarian aid to combat the famine, and concealed the targeting and looting of humanitarian assets. I do want to speak as well to the impacts of surveillance. So unlawful surveillance is undermining the infrastructure that we have built to monitor fragile situations and prevent genocide. Unlawful surveillance, including spyware, is increasingly being used in conflict situations. Access Now runs a 24-hour-a-day digital security helpline where we see more cases of civil society, as well as government and even UN leaders targeted with these cyber weapons for their work or their identity. In a recent report that we put out, Hacking in a War Zone, describes the attacks using Pegasus spyware in Armenia. including against the human rights ombudswoman, Christine Grigorian, and an unnamed UN official who is also targeted. I can get to some of the solutions that we put forward, but I do also want to say, in addition to shutdowns and unlawful surveillance, the restrictions on people flows is also hurting civil society's ability to monitor and respond. And we have just joined a campaign of justice for Noura Al-Jizawi, a Syrian human rights defender based in Canada who's facing deportation. From our RightsCon conference earlier this month in Costa Rica, Access Now and our community saw the impacts of visa and passport discrimination and have called attention to this. One defender who was able to join us in RightsCon, Karine Kanimba of Rwanda, actually herself suffered Pegasus hacking during her campaign to free her father, Paul Rusesabagina, who we know from the Hotel Rwanda story. And so, yeah, I just want to underscore how both shutdowns and surveillance combined with kind of physical and travel barriers to really limit the ability of civil society and our partners in the UN to prevent and monitor genocide.
No, thank you very much for that. I mean, I'm really shocked to hear about Noura. She is a very good friend of the center, so we will definitely join any campaign that can help her. But no, Peter, that's fantastic that you also have laid out sort of the sort of the connection between internet shutdowns and violence, and more this has become part of the playbook of any regime or government which is trying to really cover up its abuses. I mean, we have seen this from India and elsewhere too, where this has become a common occurrence in how governments justify that they want to control the sort of hate speech, but it's not so much about controlling hate speech. It's very much about shutting down any kind of information going out. So on to you, Federica. You co-authored a paper discussing atrocity crimes and emerging technologies, which suggested ways to update the UN framework of analysis for atrocity crimes to account for these new developments. Based on your research, in what ways might technological development affect the motives and incentives leading to atrocity crimes, and how can these be better accounted for in early warning?
Thank you so much, Savita, for this excellent question, and also to the Global Center and to the European Union for convening us and for having me. It's really a privilege to be part of this discussion, which is a very important one. So the paper that you mentioned, which I co-authored with my Oxford colleague, Dr. Ross Gildea, and was published last summer with the Stimson Center, essentially sets out a number of ways in which technological developments affect motives, incentives, but also the circumstances leading to atrocity crimes, and how technology more generally affects atrocity prevention and response. And maybe I can pop the paper in the chat box later for interest, but one thing that is important to underscore is that while it's likely that the core logics of atrocity crimes remain unaffected by digital technologies because the role of things like ideology, perception of grievances and interest will remain central to these crimes, tech can exacerbate or create new forms of inequalities that can shape or reshape actors' motivations. If you consider common risk factor 4, for example, pertaining to unequal distribution and control of economic resources among different groups, it's clear in light of the important role that technology plays in societies today that a significant digital divide or differentiated patterns in access and use of technology could dramatically impact existing inequalities. Additionally, these technologies can be deployed to organize and mobilize sectors of society, which in turn can also itself help consolidate political power and potentially exclude and disenfranchise weaker groups. Another way in which technology can impact the commission of atrocities is by affecting perpetrators' capacity to commit atrocity crimes. So if you look at risk factor 5, for example, technology can be used to recruit and mobilize supporters, as it was mentioned, of course, to carry out surveillance, whether individual or mass surveillance, There are many examples of this, but one that has been already cited is Myanmar, where access to surveillance technology facilitated the targeting of victims by the Tatmadaw. And of course, another example that comes to mind is the use of tech surveillance against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Technology is also relevant to risk factor 7 concerning enabling circumstances or preparatory action. If you consider, for example, indicator 7.3 that refers to the strengthening of a security apparatus, you'll see how technology becomes a factor, because technology, of course, and AI in particular, but technology more generally, has become and is increasingly becoming an important part of state security infrastructure. And there's nothing nefarious in that per se, and it would certainly be erroneous to conflate an increase in the lawful use of such tech with atrocity threats. However, absent institutional safeguards and apt legislative frameworks that explicitly protect individual rights from government outreach, AI tech can be used in countless nefarious ways and have unintended negative effects. For example, algorithmic biases and AI-driven technology can compound and amplify societal inequalities, including identity-based marginalization. Without adequate checks and balances, this tech can also provide would-be perpetrators with powerful means of directly targeting specific groups or individuals. Reliance on facial recognition technology can also have negative effects, of course, on minority groups against whom such technology is knowingly biased. And a related challenge with AI technology is with respect to that is directly relevant to preparatory action under this risk factor is the, of course, emergence of deep fakes as well, which can be used to increase the politicization of past events, thus playing into potential grievances, but also as propaganda tools and to spread inflammatory language. And of course, digital technologies can also play a role in specific risk factor indicators. For example, if you take risk factor 10 concerning the intent to commit genocide, much of the Tatmadaw systematic campaign to incite hatred and justify violence against the Rohingya minority unfolded essentially on Facebook. And given that in some countries like Myanmar, digital platforms are essentially a key source of news and information, the impact of this online incitement to violence was essential to the genocide and was immense. In terms of how these challenges can be best accounted for in early warnings, I think our paper makes many specific recommendations for each of the common risk factors and indicators that we reviewed. For example, going back to risk factor 10, including adding social media platforms to the monitoring of online trends and activities to this risk factor as a way of evidencing intent to commit genocide. Right now, the risk factor only refers to official documents, political manifestos, media records, and the like. So the inclusion of social media platforms is very important. But we also make more generic recommendations and observations, such as how tech itself can be leveraged to strengthen our early warning system and accountability. So maybe we can return to, but also how leveraging, essentially tracking differentiated patterns of access to and the use of key technologies in combination with empirical links to salient socioeconomic and political outcomes can also help us anticipate growing inequalities and thus improve our predictive capacities. There's a lot more to say, but I'll stop here for the moment. Thank you for this excellent question.
No, thank you, Federica, and thank you for once again, sort of, bringing home the point that how it's not only just about targeting populations and commission of atrocity crimes and the sort of the means of it get better, but it's also like who is getting targeted consistently and how inequalities, whether you can call it socioeconomic, but also racial. Like this is across the board. What we've seen is that racial minorities are consistently being targeted, whether it's racial and ethnic minorities, whether it's El Salvador to Myanmar to Ethiopia. So thank you very much for highlighting that. And on to you, Chris. The spread of hate speech and disinformation via social media has been a major concern for those who monitor atrocity risks. Both all three previous speakers highlighted this. What obligations do you feel private social media companies have to respond to and moderate information, hate speech, and incitement to violence on their platform? And also, does moderation work? From your experience?
That's a good question, or I should say those are good questions, since there are kind of two built in there, and probably they're more complex than I'll be able to address in a few minutes here, unfortunately. Admittedly, the sort of looking at the corporate aspect of this issue is not what I would personally call my area of expertise, but I do have some thoughts on the obligations question, and then perhaps hopefully I'll get to the second part that you asked around moderation. So there are kind of three ways that I look at the obligations that companies face in this regard. So the first, of course, are moral and social obligations. Then the second being legal and regulatory obligations, basically the system of incentives and consequences that are set out by some sort of authority. And then lastly, business, or we could say fiduciary obligations, which is something that's not discussed very often and is a bit, perhaps a bit debatable, but it's something that I'll raise in a moment. So morally and socially, I think I would imagine that everyone here agrees that both individuals and entities of whatever sort, organizations, whatever they are, including private sector companies, have moral obligations as citizens of the world, whether they be human citizens or corporate citizens, to prevent to oppose atrocities in any forms and in any form. And for companies, that means having an obligation to prevent their services or the tools that they provide from being abused to violate human rights in any way, especially to commit atrocities. The problem is that relying upon a moral or a social obligation is not really a very reliable way to do this. We do see in many different realms a lot of companies that are interested in being good citizens, but I don't think that's necessarily something that we've seen a lot in the technology sort of space, and especially not when it comes to social media companies. So if those arguments or those moral obligations aren't backed up by tangible consequences for misconduct or negligence, then we can't really rely on companies to do the right thing just sort of their own volition. Although, again, I still would argue that morally those obligations are there. Legally, it's not an area of expertise for me, but I do think that it's a bit difficult actually to say in brief what obligations that companies face here, just because it varies so greatly from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and some other speakers have already touched upon this. On the I would say, if we were to look at a couple of very contrasting examples, on the one hand we have countries like the US, which have very permissive approaches to anything that can be required or considered to fall within the realm of free speech, which is in theory a good thing, but can also be, obviously leaves a lot of space for abuse. And then on the other hand, we have countries like Germany, or now just looking more broadly, blocks like the EU, which are starting to implement regimes with more serious consequences for misconduct or negligence in this realm. So, there are, even just within looking at legalities and regulations and that sort of things, there are a lot of obligations that companies face. But I would highlight that there's a bit of a problem there as well, in that from what I've seen, even in the stricter jurisdictions, the consequences for these sorts of issues are rarely strong enough to really make a dent in relation to the profits that the major platforms are seeing. When you have a company with billions of dollars in revenue, having a fine of a few $1,000,000 or euros or what have you is not really significant. Now, I know there have been some cases where very large judgments have been rendered against them, but I don't know that there's necessarily a strong enough track record for that yet. And then, just to sort of wrap up, I think there's a business case to be made for companies taking more responsibility in this realm. So it's generally assumed that companies will maximize profits in many parts of the world. They're legally obligated to do so for the sake of their shareholders. And that, in the case of social media, means maximizing user engagement. And there's lots of research to show that sentiments like, well, anger and negative sentiments often drive greater engagement. So there is an incentive to, if not necessarily foster that sort of behavior online, at least permit it. And so the profit motive may actually discourage strong moderation or any moderation at all. But I think there's also a potential tipping point at which platforms become toxic environments that can actually drive users away and hurt profits. And I think companies need to understand that they do have an interest in maintaining healthier environments. So lastly, I'll just say that we can't rely upon companies to do these things because of moral or just business arguments, although I think they're valid. We do need, because corporate leaders may prefer to take an amoral approach or to disagree with the business case for moderation. You can see this with the changes that have happened at Twitter over the last year or so. So really what we need are legal requirements that to ultimately form the core of the approach here.
No, thank you for that. And thank you for sort of bringing in that example of Twitter, because yes, I mean, I think that even though what we're seeing there is some kind of an ideological shift, which is not driven by profit, and how that is affecting their user base. So that's a very important point. And also to sort of just bring in again and hammering home the point that it is about legal accountability, and we are letting these people get away by sort of talking about moderation and measures which in the end will not sort of affect how social media impacts hate speech or daily life or commission of atrocity crimes. So now, Alice, back to you. The leadership of your office has been instrumental in the implementation of the UN strategy and plan of action on hate speech. This plan of action recognizes the use of technology as a key factor in combating hate speech and the incitement of violence. How do you see the plan of action harnessing the potential of new technologies to prevent and respond to hate speech?
Thank you, Savita. This plan of action has been extremely useful to the UN since it was launched on June 18th, 2019 by the Secretary General. And it's now 4 years old. And about a year ago, we were able to work with the Kingdom of Morocco, get a resolution that declared the June 18th as the International Day for Countering Hate Speech. So then that has given us some focus for member states to have a solid discussion on hate speech, which has not been there before. We continue to work on that space, and especially as we know that the definition of hate speech, we don't have a universal definition for hate speech. And what actually is we describe as hate speech sometimes is contested. So in regards to what this plan of action has been able to do on digital technologies, we've had just last week on June 19th, a General Assembly high-level meeting with the President of the General Assembly and the Kingdom of Morocco, having this discussion with member states around especially digital technologies. Lots of that came out from member states. We got lots of feedback on digital technologies, although the focus was actually on hate speech as a whole, but you could see the focus that people, member states want to pay to digital technologies. And in places like Syria and Myanmar, we've seen lots of documentation, which has been very useful for this office. Documentation of possible atrocity crimes, which helps to preserve evidence and to promote accountability for such acts. And we've seen that this documentation is done at great risks to individuals themselves. We've seen it in other contexts too, in Ethiopia as well, where people document and send us the information that enables us to not only make informed decisions, but also put out statements that describe the exact situation that's happening on the ground, but also inform the early warning that we are tasked to. So in addition to these new technologies, of course, we are also paying special attention to artificial intelligence and virtual reality, which also are excellent tools for especially memorialization and education about past atrocities, and also to promote prevention. We work very closely, for example, with our team in Iraq. And UNITAD, the investigative team that promotes accountability for crimes that are committed by Daesh and ISIL, they've developed what they call the shuhud. Shuhud means witness in Arabic. And it's a digital platform that allows witnesses and survivors to submit information remotely, securely, and confidentially in relation to crimes committed by ISIL. And UNITAD also has a partnership with Microsoft Corporation in the introduction of artificial intelligence in evidence management and analysis, including facial detection and recognition, image and video indexing, and automatic voice recognition. And UNITAD has also developed this advanced digital platform for the electronic presentation and analysis of evidence. And they engage with a research organization called the SITU, a visual investigations company that merges data, design, and then therefore creates like new pathways towards accountability. So in terms of, in regard to preventing atrocity crimes, including their incitements, we really do need to engage new technologies further and much more. Because if we do, then we advance atrocity prevention. And so when I often remember that in June 2019, when the SG launched the UN Strategy and Plan of Action on hate speech and designated my office as the UN focal point on the implementation of the UN Strategy and Plan of Action on hate speech, I often remember the statements that he made then, and he was talking about how to enhance UN efforts to address the root causes and drivers of hate speech, as well as its impact on victims and societies. So once again, I'm emphasizing that there's lots that can be done digitally, but offline, the offline feeds into the digital. And so we support UN field presences, we support member states, civil society, to develop content-specific action plans on hate speech, and including on digital hate speech. And that's because one of the commitments in this strategy is to use new technologies and to engage with social media to address online hate speech. So we engage with social media platforms, as I said earlier, and we work with them to promote policies and practices on addressing online hate speech in line with the UN strategy. And since 2020, I mentioned the roundtable discussions that we've been having with tech and social media companies. We had, from the very beginning, Facebook, which is now Meta. We had Google from the very beginning. We had Twitter, we had TikTok. And in October 2021, I briefed the Security Council and I invited these social media companies, these four, especially Facebook, Google, Twitter, and TikTok, to co-brief in 2021, and we were talking about the impact, the same topic that we are discussing today. And so we keep emphasizing to them that they need to address hate speech on their platforms in line with international human rights standards. And these roundtables, we don't have them only with us as an office. The UN Strategy and Plan of Action on Hate Speech is implemented through UN agencies, and we have 22 of them. So I chair the principals meeting, and then we have a technical working team that's chaired by Simona. And we also invite to these roundtables, these UN agencies, all of them are part of these Chatham House Rules roundtables, as well as the special rapporteurs and civil society organizations working on these topics. And these roundtables, they've provided this platform for us for high-level advocacy with the companies, because we meet with their top leadership, and have been meeting for all these years to improve their efforts to address online hate speech. We've asked them to look beyond the limited scope of content removal. We've asked them to use more holistic approaches to promote positive narratives, including warnings on problematic content, to reduce that virality of posts and to counter that inauthentic coordinated behavior in other forms of disinformation related to hate speech and genocide denial, especially online. We've engaged consistently on genocide denial. So my office developed a policy guidance based on the outcomes from these roundtables that we are launching soon. We have right now, as we speak, a 60-day campaign, 60-day conversation on hate speech that's going on. It began on June 12th, when we launched in partnership with the Italian government, the mission here with the PR, we launched a plan of action for countering hate speech and for preventing incitement to violence that could lead to atrocity crimes with women. And it continues. There's something going on every week. Last week was religious leaders. Now we are moving into education. And so this link between new technologies and atrocity prevention has been prioritized by the Human Rights Council resolution that Savita, you spoke about in the first question, 499, from March 2022 on the prevention of genocide, for which Armenia is a pen holder. And this resolution has been extremely useful for us because the Human Rights Council requested the Secretary General to present a report to the Council on the topic of the role of new technologies and the impact on genocide prevention. So next week, I will be in Geneva to present this report at the 53rd session of the Human Rights Council. And the SG has already made harnessing the potential of new technologies as one of its key priorities, as you've mentioned, as reflected in the UN strategy on new technologies, as well as in our common agenda. So I'd like to stop there and also mention that at 10 o'clock, I have to go upstairs for the executive committee meeting with the SG. So please, if you will allow me, then after this, I'll leave after a few minutes. Thank you very much, Savita.
No, thank you, Alice. And for sort of highlighting the good practices and good policies that are currently underway and sort of the consultations that you're doing across the board with the system, with the companies, with civil society stakeholders. So these are all very good practices, and especially sort of the technological advances in how we are enhancing accountability is really, really useful. So good luck with the HRC next week, and thank you so much for joining us. Oh, sorry. No, with that, I'll go to Chris again. And Chris, you run the Sentinel project, and in your experience, and Alice sort of alluded to this, that how the office is also working with women, religious leaders, different parts of communities. So how does the Sentinel project's experience working with at-risk communities? In what ways are digital tools being positively used to positively influence change and prevent human rights crises at the local level? So the role of at-risk communities and local level, and are there any best practices in bolstering the efforts?
Great. Yes. Yeah, I'm happy to have a chance to talk about that, although I know that we're running out of time and I want to leave space for the other speakers who are coming after me. So I'll try to run through this quickly, although this is a topic that we could easily spend an entire 1 or 2 hour session on, I'm sure. So I'm glad that you brought this up, because it's very important for us to look at the positive uses of technology as well. And some others have alluded to this already, but technology, however we define that, is definitely a double-edged sword overall, even if some specific tools might favor oppressors more than citizens or human rights defenders. But there really is great potential for technology to enable threatened communities themselves, as well as their supporters and collaborators, to do various things to address these situations. So one is identifying and monitoring early warning signs of atrocities, and this can happen through various means, whether it's setting up crowdsourcing systems that enable members of the public to report various types of relevant information, social media monitoring, using satellite imagery or even drones to gather relevant geospatial data. A lot of that can also help with documentation of atrocities as they do happen. That kind of work as well then can help to better inform and support preventive measures that are implemented often at local levels. So that can mean, for example, countering the spread of harmful rumors and misinformation that create the atmosphere of fear and distrust and hatred that can enable violence. And there's a whole other conversation to be had about the relationship between misinformation and hate speech and how we address those sorts of things together, rather than as two, sort of distinct phenomena. So we can also work with technology to set up systems, and this is just kind of building upon what I've already said, that help to ensure that threatened people are aware of changing situations, such that, so this is getting a bit more away from prevention and a bit more into mitigation, but to actually help people to navigate dangerous situations and avoid violence if it does occur. So, for example, a big area that we want to move into is localized early warning. So going down from looking at, sort of state level risk assessments that are done over the course of, maybe 1, 2, 3 years, and looking at subnational regions like provinces, states, cities, towns, villages, et cetera, that are at risk over the scale of months, weeks, or days, to help people, again, especially to deal with dangers as they arise. And things like mobile technology, mesh networks, et cetera, are really useful for that. And then I already mentioned, I believe, the ability to document abuses and enable threatened communities to communicate with the outside world to try prompting international action. So just to address the question of best practices, there's a lot to discuss there as well, but I think one overall theme that should underlie or underpin all of this is the importance of engaging with affected communities. So rather than sort of imposing a solution from the outside, it's important to actually communicate with people who are facing these threats and learning what they actually see in terms of threats, and then also needs and opportunities for reducing those risks. Or assisting people in the face of such risks. I think there are a lot of approaches that can work in many different contexts, but it's important to always adjust those approaches to suit local contexts instead of just 100% completely copy and pasting something from one situation to another, and then expecting the people themselves to try to adapt. So really having things be locally led as much as possible, even if we're replicating things, is very, very critical. And along with that, just the last point is to work at the most local level possible, even when we're dealing with large scale threats that may be state driven, because even if we look historically at cases of very large scale mass atrocities, they didn't happen, they weren't implemented in the same way in every single place at the exact same time. So there is still a lot of local variability and nuance, even within very large scale situations, that is really relevant to look at. So we have to be both strategic and, I would say, tactical, to use that terminology, in our approach to this. So I will stop there.
No, thanks, Chris. And then, as in everything, prevention and mitigation context matters. So that's like a really great point. Peter, how can increasing internet access and internet and network connectivity within the general public improve human rights situations or prevent atrocities?
Well, thanks. And you can draw on what the special advisor said, in terms of human rights documentation. And there's really a maturity to the open source intelligence operations, to the point that this OSINT work that helps document and find accountability and attribution for all sorts of online and offline attacks is being cited in major prosecutions by the International Criminal Court, as well as in courts across Europe. And then again, drawing on actually what Christopher just put forward, not all connectivity is the same. Not all connectivity is meaningful. Not all connectivity is open and secure. And so, hearing from my colleagues in Myanmar, where the state has really, the junta really has directed itself towards complete and comprehensive control of the legacy telecommunications networks, just going online could put you further at risk, especially as biometric and digital ID systems are rolled out that are linked to things like SIM card registration. So likewise in Ethiopia, I think the failures of Meta, Facebook, to moderate content and take down really clear incitement to violence turned people against the platform altogether. So there are these regional variances, but I can say overall that the more connections a country, a nation has to the global internet, the more likely it is they'll find open and safe ways to communicate, to seek and impart information. the fewer choke points, the better. And so this requires greater support. States need to step up in funding, rights respecting infrastructure, but also empowering local folks to build and maintain that. So you're not just parachuting in, a workforce through kind of a debt structured plan. The resilience that civil society and, as I've said, UN officials even and actors need to identify and resist digital attacks also requires funding from states. We have seen some successes in places like Sudan, where groups have been able to really innovate in ways to stay online and have captured atrocities as they've occurred and gotten that information and video documentation out. And that also helped efforts to litigate to end internet shutdowns there and to find accountability. So this growing constellation of actors, whether it's journalists and organizations like International Crisis Group, IGO actors like the Genocide Office, the OSINT and open source community, all depend on these digital tools, both to prevent and stop, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and others, but also to find accountability afterwards. This is something that Access Now, of course, supports through our #KeepItOn campaign against internet shutdowns, that we're increasingly working with humanitarian actors to look at ways that their community and their needs can be addressed, beyond the reach of human rights system and law, and as well at the Security Council. I think, frankly, internet shutdowns should be on the UN Security Council's agenda, as again, these events are increasingly tied to the crimes under their purview. But just to answer your question, though, especially post-COVID, the general public's access to financial transactions, health and medicinal interventions, education, and humanitarian assistance all increasingly occur online and are furthered by connectivity, and this will have knock-on effects in this case.
No, that's really positive. So connectivity, the better it is. And thank you for bringing in sort of the recommendation to how the Security Council needs to sort of, move on the agenda and incorporate how digital shutdowns are in the end a precursor to some, sometimes grave violations. Federica, the last word is to you, and since you have done an incredible amount of work on accountability and also on the digital space, can you talk a little bit more about sort of the relationship between the new and improved technologies and our ability to sort of hold perpetrators accountable?
Absolutely, I can. And thank you again for another fantastic question. I think this might be one of my favorite things to discuss, in fact. So thank you for asking. There's, I think, immense scope to better and more systematically incorporate new technologies and tech-derived methods to bolster monitoring, early warnings, but also, as you were asking, about accountability efforts. And some of this has already been sort of touched upon, but to provide, a bit more of a big picture sort of assessment, at a minimum, I think the certain low-cost documentary technologies that include satellite imagery, radio, radar, and other forms of remote sensing capacity, including commercial drones, should be more systematically used alongside open source information and other methods, which might also include, social network and data analysis for monitoring purposes, as they can assist with many things, including the tracking of movements and individuals, or even the mood of specific groups, sometimes being able to predict with amazing precision the outbreak and location of identity-based protests and other atrocity risk factors, some studies have shown. But the same low-cost technologies can also be instrumental for fact-finding, documentation, and investigative purposes. Of course, again, in combination with more traditional methods. And in fact, in this space, the advantages of new technologies, digital, documentary, and investigative methods can be immense. So satellite imagery and other forms of remote sensing capacities can be used, for example, to verify and corroborate the construction and use of military installations or other buildings, such as prison camps. For example, they can be used to track the movement, again, of convoys, as mentioned, but also to document and geolocate specific incidents, as well as this aftermath. And they can be used in triangulation, for example, with witness statements, precisely for those verification purposes. In addition, because digital technologies can theoretically be used anywhere, something they allow to do actually is that they permit meaningful monitoring, documentation, and investigation of possible atrocities remotely, even for so-called black hole environments where information is deliberately hidden by local authorities or is otherwise scarce. And one example of this is, of course, the DPRK. This is, by the way, of direct relevance to UN mandated investigations, those mandated by the Human Rights Council in particular, and to the need to strengthen the Office of the High Commissioner's digital capacity, given that it's OHCHR that supports these mandates at the infrastructure level. And this is something that myself and other colleagues at Oxford have been calling for some time. But certain documentary tools, including like apps like Witness to Atrocity, for example, can also be instrumental to the civil society actors in safely collecting, verifying, and transmitting evidence of specific incidents. And of course, as mentioned, open source investigations and tech-derived evidence can have countless other applications of relevance to accountability efforts, including judicial accountability efforts. As we've seen, as Peter was just mentioning, we're starting to see a lot of this digital information crop up in indictments, convictions, just essentially, be part of the evidentiary body on which courts, both international courts and domestic courts, rely on to carry out proceedings. And this is also true, not just for criminal courts, but for courts adjudicating state responsibility. A lot of this information one example of this very clear is the Gambia-Myanmar case at the ICJ, but also there's countless examples of proceedings against Russia at the European Court of Human Rights. So, and of course, this information cannot entirely substitute more traditional forms of evidence and information, but it can have a force multiplier effect. And the same is true for other applications across a range of transitional justice and tools or other political accountability purposes. In terms of political accountability, certainly we're seeing how open source investigations and digital technologies are actually are playing an instrumental role in helping to overturn state narratives, in allowing greater oversight and transparency, and also in contributing, as we were saying, to transitional justice processes like the memorialization case that the special advisor was mentioning earlier. And in fact, on this note, I want to give, I'd like to take the chance to give a shout out to the creators of Nobody's Listening, which is an immersive exhibition using virtual reality essentially to commemorate the 5th anniversary of the Yazidi genocide by ISIS. And it's been very effective essentially in allowing those that participate and that immerse themselves in the experience through VR to experience what it was like for Yazidi victims to be, stuck in Mount Sinjar. So, again, there's so much to say, but we're out of time. So I think I'm just going to leave it there and take this opportunity to say really thank you for convening this discussion. It's very important, and I'm just really thrilled that I've had the chance to be part of it.
No, thank you very much, Federica, and thank you for highlighting that how these technologies can be useful where we have no access. And that's not only, DPRK is a very, very stark example, but across the board, even in Ethiopia or with HRC mandated mechanisms, many times when you don't have state consent to for the investigative mechanism to go there, these tools can be a complementary tools to whatever we hear from the witnesses and survivors and victims. Thank you so much for adding so much nuance to a conversation which sometimes gets reduced to just sort of countering hate speech and just talking about social media platforms. This was a very good conversation, and I learned so much, and I hope that our EU delegation colleagues and others across the board who were able to join us were also able to understand the different nuances, not only the harmful impact, but sort of the benefits we have at our disposal because of greater connectivity and digital technologies. So thank you everybody for joining us. I would really like to thank all our expert speakers, as well as our co-hosts, the delegation of the European Union. Have a great day, and if you have missed any part of this conversation, you can find the recording on the Global Center website. We will also be posting it and sharing it through our social media network, so you can find them there too. But a big thank you to all of you, and have a fantastic day.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you too.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.